Good morning. This is Richard Fallenbaum, and I'm welcoming you to the January 22nd, 23 presentation of Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. Before the pandemic, we met at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library in Oakland, California. Currently, we are meeting on this Zoom format, and so we welcome participants from around the world and the United States, of course. We've been doing this. These Marxist presentations for about 15 years, with a wide variety of speakers. With our objective is to encourage the spread of radical and Marxist thought. Our motto is the philosophers. It's taken from the 11th thesis of Feuerbach by Karl Marx. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And I want to just clarify, this might seem an odd motto for a Marxist study group, but Marx didn't mean that we could just change the world without having knowledge of the world. Quite the opposite. He believed, and we believe, that scientific knowledge of the processes of social development are crucial to make positive changes in the world. So that's our contribution to the world revolutionary movement, is to try and to clarify and spread knowledge, scientific knowledge of social developments and other scientific developments also. So we have a wide variety of speakers and topics, generally, mostly Marxists, but not always, but certainly in the progressive direction. Our session today is entitled Nuclear Weapons and the Ukrainian War, and our speaker is Mark Albertson. Mark is a historical research editor of Army Aviation magazine and is the historian for the Army Aviation Association of America. He teaches at Norwalk Community College in Connecticut and speaks extensively around the country. He's coming to us from Connecticut in the United States. I'll be moderator, and as I mentioned before, this session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube in a couple of days. We strongly urge you to check it out. Check out our previous presentations, which we have listed on our website, Marx.org, I think, ICSS and there's also a place there for you to sign up, if you're not signed up, to get regular announcements of our meetings and to contribute financially. So with that, I'd like to turn over the session to Mark, who will speak for something under an hour, and that'll be followed by another hour of discussion and questions. So go ahead, Mark. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, good evening, if that's where you are. This is about atomic weapons, and I'm going to speak a bit of the time here on the history of atomic weapons, or the atom bomb, let's call it that. And I'd like to start with September 1945. My father was a radio man in the United States Navy. He was in most of the war. At this point, he was on a ship called the USS Ottawa. It was an attack transport. They carried Marines. And he went to Nagasaki in late September 1945, and they were delivering Marines. And I wrote this in a book I published called On History, a Treatise. It's in chapter 4. And I started with, I don't know how many here are familiar with Sir John Jackie Fisher. Fisher was a naval designer. He was also an odd duck. He used to like to do ballroom dancing by himself, but he was an intelligent gentleman. He became good friends with Winston Churchill. In fact, he's the man who really designed what they call the battle cruiser. And having done that, he said, this is what Jackie Fisher says: the essence of war is violence. Moderation in war is imbecility. Interesting take here by Sir John Jackie Fisher. But when my father and these other sailors and Marines were standing on the deck of the Ottawa as they were just chugging into Nagasaki Harbor, my father told me I wrote this, but he told me along these lines, his observation here. Ahead, there was only destruction, total destruction, a wasteland of shattered buildings, incinerated homes, and scorched earth. A desolate moonscape that became more horrifying as the great steel prow cut lazily through the black waters, pushing through a flotsam of burned and bloated bodies that bobbed like corks in the creamy wake. Occupation troops were set to go ashore. They would face no opposition because, you see, the city was dead. Oh, and it was. And my father said, he said, all these sailors and Marines are watching this and had never seen anything like this before. You know, when you've been at war for 3 years, you know, you've seen villages, towns, maybe the occasional city that has shell craters, bomb craters, buildings in various stages of disrepair. But as my father explained it to me, he said, there's no crater here. There's just rubble. He said it was like God took his arm, swept it across the breakfast table, and left the crumbs. And there's nobody around to be seen. There's nobody. He says that's why all those bodies were still in the harbor for 6 weeks. There's nobody around to pick them up. And my father wound up by saying, if more, he's only 20 at this point, and he went in at 17, and he said, if politicians, leaders, and diplomats saw what we saw that day, there would never be another goddamn war. That's what he said. And my father died 60 years later at 80. And the day before he died, he was talking about Nagasaki as if it had just happened. The day before he died. We had an interesting conversation about this. But again, this is also the bomb. The bomb is also a product of levée en masse. I've brought that term up before in past discussions here. And that goes back to Lazare Carnot during the French Revolution, August of 1793, when he organized France to fight all the monarchs of Europe. And from here on out, this is what man's going to do in major wars. He will conscript entire populations and economies for war. I've even taught that this was really what the Civil War becomes. This was America's first industrialized, corporatized, commercialized war. And that's where it's going from here. In fact, in a little bit of a chit chat before most of you signed on, I mentioned that even chemical weapons were discussed in the North. And it was decided that is not what we are, and it's not a way to fight that's inhuman, and we're not using them. That discussion wasn't really had in 1914, 15. You see where man is going here. Now, the idea of nuclear weapons, we weren't the first ones to come out of the starting gate. It's Otto, Hahn, and Fritz Strassman that split the atom. And which country are they working for? Nazi Germany. You know, the notion of atomic energy was not new. It's not new at all. That, you know, there were discussions about atomic energy back in the 19th century, but of course the technology doesn't exist. The science has yet to be created, but it was thought to be possible, splitting the atom. And finally in 1938, the atom is split. And that's when Einstein is going to warn Roosevelt, you know, the Germans are out of the starting gate. Can you imagine Hitler with a bomb? Now that's not going to work because the Nazis are later going to call the atomic science Jewish physics, because a lot of the scientists involved were Jewish. Not all of them, but a lot of them were. Well, who the heck cares what religion your scientists practice if they can get you the product? Although let's understand something about at this point in history, the Germans already had the weapon of mass destruction years before the United States got the bomb. It's the first of the second generation chemical weapons. It's called nerve gas. Tabin, sarin, Soman. And the Germans had it in abundance. They never used it. That's really a separate talk, but that's as far as I'm going with that. But the United States is the country that will do the real research and get the bomb. Now let's understand something too. The Japanese were also working on it. You know, the British knew this was possible. The Italians knew this was possible. The French, the Germans, the Russians, they all knew this was possible. But the Japanese were also working on the bomb, and they were doing their research in North Korea. They had moved a lot of their research from Japan when the B-29 started bombing Japan. They're out of the range of the 29s. And there was even a story going around that the Japanese tested one. I don't see any documentation for that, but that story was going around. But when the United States is ready to test their bomb on July 16, 1945 at Alamogordo, Operation Trinity, it was discussed just prior to this, Oppenheimer, some of these other scientists, why don't we invite a delegation of Japanese to the United States to witness the test? Other thinkers are going to decide otherwise. One of them is General Groves. He says, if we do this, and since no one's done this before, supposing it doesn't work, where did your credibility go? Out the door. They decide not to do it. They test the bomb and it works. And Truman's going to drop two of them, August 6, 1945, August 9, 1945. Now let's add something else to this. It was decided at Yalta in early February 1945, the last time Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin meet. And Churchill's going to die 2 months later, April 12, 45, that 3 months after the Nazis capitulate, the Soviet Far Eastern Army will enter the war in the Pacific. And they do. August 9, 1945, they attack Manchuria. They attack the Japanese Kwantung Army. The bombs will be, you know, that's one of the worst, that must be one of the worst days in Japanese history. You know, August 6, 1945, the emperor finally comes around and says, hey, look, he tells the militarists didn't want to surrender even after the first bomb. And he says, put together a meeting and you better discuss this. And we have to call a halt. And they scheduled the meeting for 10:30 in the morning on August 9, 1945. And the United States drops the second bomb the same day the Soviets attacked the Kwantung Army in Manchuria. This must be one of the worst days in Japanese history, but they will surrender. The problem here is, now what do you do in the post-war world? That's an issue. There are two thinkers in this country, and I find these two gentlemen absolutely fascinating. One is Lieutenant General Roy S. Geiger of the United States Marine Corps. He is, by this point, he's a lieutenant general, he's 3 stars, but he's the Fleet Marine Force commander of the Pacific Theater. He goes to Bikini Island for Operation Crossroads. And this man witnesses the atomic test the Navy does against ships in the Bikini Lagoon. He gets back to his office in Pearl Harbor, and he writes a letter to General Alexander Archie Vandergrift, the commandant of the United States Marine Corps. And this is what he says. He says, amphibious landings as done as Sicily, Normandy, and Okinawa are no longer feasible because in the future, someone else besides the United States is going to have the bomb. Picture a bomb being dropped at Normandy. What would have happened to those landings? He says, we need to expand on the helicopter and light aircraft. You can land troops on a beach, but you use light aircraft and helicopters to disperse the troops. And then at the proper time, bring them together for the big push if it's possible. Another man here, Major General James M. Gavin. He is probably America's parachutist extraordinaire at this point. He became a general at age 37. He landed by parachute at Sicily. He landed by parachute at Normandy. He also was in, if you remember the movie, The Bridge Too Far, the 3 bridges they tried to take, and they lost the bridge. They didn't get the bridge at Nijmegen, and the Germans held out. He also landed here. And he was writing in a magazine, and I have a lot of old archived copies of these, and they're fascinating to read, from the American military. And he wrote in 1946 that one of the reasons is because of the bomb, that the future of moving troops is in the air. Light planes, and guess what else? Helicopters. He reasons that silk is not accurate. Guys get blown all over the place. The gliders are not proof. They're made of plywood. You can reuse them, yes, but sometimes you can't reuse them. But developing the helicopter, yes. A helicopter can go vertically, it can go horizontally. You can drop your troops off after they're done fighting, pick them up, and then move them. He said it's a lot more, it's a lot safer than silk. And so these two guys begin to push the Army and the Marine Corps to move in this direction. Now, these two guys are you've heard that saying, why fight the next war like they did the last war? That's not what these two guys want to do. And the helicopter will prove itself on 2 battlefields that aren't nuclear. And those battlefields are Vietnam and Korea beforehand. However, at the same time, the Soviets will blow a bomb in 1949. And Geiger was right. America no longer has the monopoly. And this was going to happen. Look back at history with the knife, the hammer, the sword, the spear, the bow and arrow. Once somebody has it, everyone's going to get it. Why should atomic weapons be any different? Why should they be any different? And yet at this point, after Korea, an incident here happens in 1954. It's called Dien Bien Phu. 15,000 French paratroopers are surrounded by 55,000 North Vietnamese troops. And on top of that, the North Vietnamese have another 50,000 support troops who are schlepping supplies. Do you know that they were almost 300 kilometers from the Chinese border? Do you know these people move these supplies on foot and bicycles through the jungles? That's determination. That's determination. And the French are screaming for help from the United States. And do you know, and I was doing some research on this when I was with Army Aviation Magazine, on the helicopter, but I also did a lot of research on the first Indochina War. Do you know that in 1953, going into 1954, the American taxpayer was footing over 72% of the French bill? Do you know we put $1.0563 billion into this just in the year 1953, going into 54? All that money wasted, right? And yet at the same time, there's a discussion going on in Washington. This is called Operation Vulture. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff are discussing this with Eisenhower. The French need help. And with this discussion, General Nathan Twining, if you've ever heard of him, he was Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Admiral Arthur Radford, Chief of Staff, United States Navy. They want this Operation Vulture. The plan is to launch, get this, 60 B-29s from the Philippines, escorted by 150 Navy carrier fighters, and bomb the North Vietnamese who are surrounding the French. Admiral Matthew Ridgway, the Chief of Staff of the Army, is against this. He says, if you're going to get involved in North Vietnam, it's going to take 7 divisions. But he says, bear in mind, the Chinese will probably get involved and it'll take 10. And then you want to staff troops for NATO in Europe. Eisenhower, and then Twining and Radford talk about, well, what about dropping a low-level nuke or two on the North Vietnamese? And Eisenhower says, if we do, we'll have to deny it for 20 years. Then he says, we are not doing anything unless I get consideration from Congress. That means a declaration of war. Well, keep in mind, July 27, 1953, the stalemate of Korea is less than a year prior, because this is May 1954. And what does Congress do? No. Eisenhower says we're not going. In other words, he did what the presidents are supposed to do. Congress, the president doesn't declare war. Congress is supposed to declare war. That's in the Constitution of the United States. And so we don't go to war. No nukes are used. But they're in Europe through the mid to late 50s. American troops are training here on the ground with NATO troops, training for a nuclear battlefield. They are using light planes, using helicopters to move people around on a battlefield theorized to be nuclear. Now, keep in mind something else. When you had NSA 47, National Security Act 1947, the United States, the Air Force was divorced from the Army. That's when it became the United States Air Force. This new service has the lock at this point on the atomic bomb. Why? Because of the strategic bomber. The Navy wants a piece of this. You know what the Navy wants to do to get in on the nuclear game? Their aircraft carriers from World War II are only 20, 23, 25,000 tons. Their aircraft are 6, 8, 10, 12,000 pounds. If you're going to carry a nuclear weapon, you need planes that are going to be 25,000 pounds, 30,000 pounds, 35,000 pounds. You can't do this on a 23, 25,000 ton aircraft carrier. You need aircraft carriers 60,000 tons, 65,000 tons. But get this, the Air Force does not want to share nuclear technology. They don't want to share the bomb. You know what the admirals do? It's called the Admirals' Revolt. They don't want to support NSA 47. So there's going to be a compromise made. The Navy is going to eventually get their 60, 65, 70,000 ton aircraft carriers. I mean, these things are like floating islands, and they're going to get these planes to be able to shuttle nuclear bombs in the 1950s. So the Air Force has to give up the monopoly, and the Army not to be left out. in the 1950s they'll be designed, and they will get 280 millimeter artillery pieces that are able to fire battlefield nuclear warheads on their artillery rounds. And so this is why they were training for a nuclear battlefield in Europe. We haven't seen this used yet. Will we? I don't know. You know, I'm not going to go into the Cuban Missile Crisis. You folks know all about that very well. But what about 1973? You remember the Yom Kippur War? At one point, the Israelis almost lost that war. However, this is almost like Ukraine. Do you know they were drawing down on stocks in NATO of artillery pieces, M60 tanks, British Chieftain tanks, and sending them from NATO stocks to bolster the Israelis who had lost a lot of armored equipment and guns. That will turn the war around for the Israelis. The Soviets, who did next to nothing to help the Arabs, their clients, in the 67 war, threatened to send in airborne units. The response is really not from Nixon. The response is from Kissinger. Remember, we're getting into Watergate at this point. Nixon's besieged. Guess who's taking more command here? Henry. And he told the Soviets, you can send those airborne units, but we're going to put nuclear forces on first alert. And the Soviets backed off. You could have had another Cuban Missile Crisis here in the desert. Doesn't happen. However, as you move along here toward what we see in Ukraine, we are still afflicted with nuclear weapons, and we even have more powers that now have nuclear weapons. It's not just the major powers anymore. How about Israel? How about North Korea? How about Pakistan? India can be considered now a major power, but they still jealously guard. They don't really want any new members here in this club. It's a very closed club. And that's what gets you to Ukraine. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine automatically became the world's third largest nuclear weapons power. That did not set well in Washington, London, or Moscow. And you had to denuclearize Ukraine. So how are they going to do this? They're going to sit down and negotiate. And there's an agreement called the Trilateral Agreement. It's signed in January of 1994 between the United States, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine. Ukraine will give up their nuclear weapons. The first to go will be the battlefield nuclear weapons type, or those with short range, tactical nuclear weapons. But what about the strategic nuclear weapons? The Soviets had 30 bear and backfire bombers. Those are bomber types that are able to carry nuclear bombs. In fact, those 30 bombers could carry up to 416 pieces of nuclear ordnance. Though those bombers will go back to Russia, as will the bombs. But what about the ICBMs, the intercontinental ballistic missiles? Just the Soviets had put in the ground in Ukraine 130 SS-19 intercontinental ballistic missiles, each capable of carrying 6 warheads. That means each missile can target 6 American cities. They also had 46 SS-24 intercontinental ballistic missiles, each of which can carry 10 warheads. The Ukrainians will give this up. They will give all this up. On December 5, 1994, the Budapest Memorandum is signed. And I find this an extremely significant agreement. because within this agreement signed by Ukraine as the object of the exercise, by Britain, the Britain and the British Isles, John Major, remember John Major? He signed this. The Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, and for the United States, William Jefferson Clinton. Leonid Kukma signed it for Ukraine. He was president of Ukraine then. And in this agreement, since Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons, the other three signers besides Ukraine were supposed to respect Ukrainian territorial integrity, Ukrainian sovereignty, Ukrainian political independence and structures and institutions. They were supposed to observe these without infringing on Ukrainian independence. What has happened since December of 1994? And interestingly enough, when you understand this situation, how do you think this sells in places like Jerusalem, Islamabad, Tehran, Pyongyang? In other words, what I'm telling you, the signatures of the big powers are not worth the paper they're printed on. Now, if you understand that both sides have made noises with nuclear weapons, Biden has, Putin has. However, will they be used? Will they be used? One country to me that sticks out here, and it's the country, and it's the country that's the big supporter of Russia, is China. You know, this is no longer the China of 1950. This is the China of 2023. And China, you know, they've moved beyond this the peasant revolutionary doctrine, and they've adopted state capitalism to bolster their socialism and spread it. That's bad. Nuclear war would be bad for business. Let's put it this way. And I think one of the countries that would be one of the biggest brokers of a non-nuclear exchange and maintaining the war in this fashion is going to be China. I don't have that kind of confidence myself in the United States. This is the United States post-Cold War. We don't have the army we used to have during the Cold War. And right now, we are not in the financial situation we were in during the Cold War. The dollar is under assault. We are upside down financially. In fact, the last time I checked, the United States gross domestic product is $19,461 billion. The debt is now over 31 trillion. If anything's going to get you into a nuclear war, as far as the United States goes, it could be that, starting with battlefield nuclear weapons. And I think China is one of those leaders in not allowing that to happen. Number one, they don't have the nuclear weapons that Russia, the Russian Federation has, or the United States. That has to be acknowledged too. But I think at this stage of the game, you know, the regard that Washington and Moscow had for maintaining the peace and not using nuclear weapons has worn away with those Cold War warriors. It's a different generation. It's a different crop of people. And I think it's having a nuclear exchange now is more of a concern than it was 30 years ago. Now, people can disagree with that. But from what I see with the military, and I'm not talking the military, I'm talking the politicians that we have today. Keep in mind too, and just as a little added feature here, we still have over 36 embassies that don't have an ambassador. China, and I find this is interesting because it shows that China is putting on a good face as a nation that's politically stable, by having almost every embassy they have an ambassador. Do you know Italy is ticked off with the United States because they're a NATO power and we haven't had an ambassador here? Interesting. Absolutely fascinating how something like this could sell this picture of China as a well-run, well-organized political entity, as opposed to the United States. I'm going to stop now in case anybody has any questions, observations, comments, or any other thoughts that they might have.
Thank you, Mark. Before we go to questions and comments, I'm going to turn over the meeting to Jean, who will give us a preview of some of our upcoming events. Go ahead, Jean. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Mark. This is very thought-provoking, and I'm sure I see a lot of people have their hands up already. But let me just say we have some good talks coming up. And these are all on our regular email thing, and you can sign up for our emails at our website, ICSSmarks.org. But next week, we have the militarization of the police. Many of us feel it's bad enough we have the militarization of the military, but Steve will talk to us about the militarization of the police. And then Sunday, February 5th, Mark will be back with us to speak on Hitler's rise to power. I think this is something like the 90th anniversary of that fateful event. Following that, Sunday, February 12th, we have our friend Yusuf speaking on Stalin's book, Marxism and the Problems of Linguistics, which will be a very interesting one. So we have some great programs coming up, and it's back to you, Richard.
Thank you. So if the viewers on Zoom want to ask a question or comment, please use the hand raising option on Zoom. You can do it by clicking on the reactions icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can raise your hand there. And we ask you to keep your comments and questions brief so that we can get to as many as possible, and so that Mark can make his many comments. I have three questioners already on the docket. First Sharon, then Raj, then Yusuf, and then Eugene. Go ahead, Sharon.
Thank you, Mark, very much for reminding us and shedding more light on the history, the details of the history. I would like to share my personal memory of the atomic bomb. So I was 3 years old, and my family was in New York from California visiting my grandparents, who lived in Staten Island and right near the water. So on the day that the American people learned that the war was over, which was probably August 10th, I'm not sure, they turned on the foghorns in the harbor, and everybody was running in and out of my grandparents' house, screaming and crying and hugging. I had two uncles in the war, and somebody else in our family was lost at Pearl Harbor. So everybody was celebrating, and I remember it because it was so loud, you know. And my grandfather was weeping. And I asked my mom, why is Grandpa crying? And she said, because our country dropped a terrible, horrible bomb on the people of Japan. And that was my first political lesson. I was 3 years old. So my question is, can we talk a little bit about the anti-nuclear movement, as it were, the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy. I don't remember when that was established, but it was important. And the American people, were never really educated about the decision to drop not one, but 2 bombs on Japan. And it was never really a political issue because everybody was so happy that they saved all those American lives from having to be expended in a land invasion of Japan. It's da 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 da. And besides, the Russians were horrible, and we had we had to have the Cold War and everything. But can we talk a little bit about if you have any historical references about how people tried to, progressive people tried to raise the whole question of the mutual assured destruction policy?
Yeah, one of those was Robert Oppenheimer. He was not a fan of, they built the weapon. They built the weapon, but he was not really a fan of using it. Feeling that we've unleashed this force that could, really pursue our destruction. And it can. I mean, the first bombs come out, you're by comparison to today's weapons, the first bombs that came out are really local. They don't have the blast effects they do today. In fact, the UN did a study on this, Sharon, about 30 years ago, where I live in Norwalk, Connecticut. If one of those Russian warheads, those which they now measure in megatons, not kilotons, ever hit Times Square, I live 40 miles from New York City, north. We would still see the flash. And they tell you, you don't look that direction because you'll go blind. You'll go blind. So we're talking about the advancement, and this was going to happen anyway, Sharon. The evolution of man's technology. And I've said this in other talks when I give my talks on levee en masse. Every generation of new weapons, this evolution of technology, and it's all funded by capitalism, right? It's all funded by capitalism, but every new mark of weaponry reaps an ever greater harvest of humanity. Why should nuclear weapons be any different? It's a product of man's mind. So he's going to improve on, if you want to use the term, improve on that product. It's like a car, it's like power tools, like anything else. It's still an evolution of technology. And so now we're at the point where if we loose these things, this is no longer Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They're not destroying 2.5 miles of a city center. You can literally destroy life on Earth. And so it gets to be, what's the point? What's the point? Yet, when you have a country like the United States, in which the press is in bed with your government and big business, these discussions are not going to be had. It's the people themselves who have to do their research and then have the discussions, because like many changes, many movements, and you know this, many changes start from the bottom up, not the top down. That's how this works. How do you think you got Social Security? But that's the reality here. But, when the war was over, going back to when you were 3 years old, and a lot of these World War II vets, I've interviewed a lot of them. And the ones that really matter here, Sharon, are the guys that fought in Europe whose units were supposed to be sent to the Pacific. Jesus, I put up with this, now I got to go put up with that. And they all tell me, thank God Truman dropped the bomb, because now I don't have to go. Okay, there's that perspective. But, when you look at nuclear weapons, look at it in the time in question. These guys don't have to go. But what has it cost us over the ensuing decades? Nobody sees that then. Very few do. Maybe Oppenheimer did, But most people, no, the war is over with. Now I can get back to my life, and they build the middle class. Everything's fine in the 50s. You know how that went, and so they're not thinking of this. They're not thinking of this. People are people. They're not, that's the way they are. That's the way they are, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. The next speaker is Raj. Go ahead.
Hey,
Hello,
Mark.
Raj.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for the. I always enjoy your very passionate, dramatic lecture on history. I didn't have a history teacher like that, but I'm glad you're there. Now, a couple of observations. I actually wrote a paper in 1995, the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I did research at that time, not to write a book, but an article. My research showed that the nuclear bomb was dropping was a political decision, not a military one. And it was done basically to announce that US is the new boss, and basically it was directed against Soviet Union gaining greater influence, stopping communism. So that's one conclusion.
Right.
So it is about capitalism's expansion, not about human beings, because Russians never exercised that kind of ambition to nuke others. So that was a different social system under USSR, who was the primary nuclear weapons adversary of the United States. They never had their nuclear doctrine then, and in fact now is not the first use. Now that could change in a war situation, but what I'm saying is that shows you the expression of a different type of system. And capitalist system is aggressive, coming out of its own mechanism of profit making and profit rate. So that's my comment. The other thing I wanted to observe, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but I want you to correct in Ukraine, the nuclear weapons that were placed there, that were very substantial, were actually controlled by Soviet military.
That's correct.
Soviet military controlled it. Ukraine, when it separated, did not have automatic right to acquire them. They were placed there, but so the question was, what happens to Soviet military when it becomes Russian military? So it is not quite correct to argue that Ukraine voluntarily gave up. They, first of all, did not have a right to own them because the center was Moscow, not Kiev. So I want you to comment on that. If I'm wrong, correct me. Okay, that other thing is that Russia, to my knowledge, never in Ukraine said they will use the nuclear weapons. They said we will use the nuclear weapons only if our existence is seriously threatened,
Right.
either by invasion or destruction of our military. Of course, that could be in Ukraine. Petraeus, they were responding to Petraeus saying, let's nuke them. He said, put it differently. He said, well, if they use nuclear weapons, they lose their army, meaning we will put a nuke. But it was a threat. I'm sure he was authorized by Biden to say that. That's when Putin responded. So it is, I think, is incorrect that both sides have you're correct in saying both sides used it, but the context has to be put in. If you agree with that, if not, please explain to me something that I may not know. Thank you.
No, it is, you're right, because, but the thing is, both sides have made noises. The problem with this is we are no longer, this is no longer like Vietnam. This is no longer Iraq, and it's no longer Afghanistan. And so what needs to be really digested here, and I'm trying to digest where I work, is this the change in how war is going to be fought? Are we going back to conventional war? And I think that's the problem. If you're fighting a counterinsurgency, that's one thing, but you're not fighting a counterinsurgency. In fact, Raj, I'm sure you've been paying attention to the news. We're sending over 50 Bradley fighting vehicles here. The British are going to send over 14 Chieftain 2 tanks here. We're also going to send over 100 M113 armored personnel carriers. And the Marine Corps are giving up a lot of their artillery because now they're moving to the Pacific where they'll be shuffled around by ship. And they don't need the artillery they were going to use in Europe. Where's this artillery going, Raj? It's going to Ukraine. This is top flight. This is top shelf stuff. So one has to ask the question, in the beginning, they weren't going to give them tanks. They weren't going to give them armored personnel carriers. Are they setting them up for a spring offensive once the winter's over? Is that what's happening here? Now, is that going to raise the stakes for even a low-level nuke? That remains to be seen. But having said that, at the same time here, at the same time, going backwards a little bit, you are right. This was a political decision in 1945. And since I wrote 2 books on the round the world cruise of the Great White Fleet, the decision you saw in 45 in part is along those lines, the decision Theodore Roosevelt made. We're going to send 16 battleships around the world and announce to the world that America now is a global power. And you did that then with naval power. So what happened in 1907, 1909, Raj, is a repeat in 1945, but with a different weapon. It's called atomic weaponry. And I do concur that this idea of the Soviet Union, because of what they did on the Eastern Front, they're the ones that won the land war, are now bringing this idea of the working class revolution, socialism, now on the world stage. And something has to be done to correct that. And that's 1945. That's not the only reason for 45, but it's a large part of this. So yeah, I would kind of agree with it. And you're hearing that from an ex-Republican, so
What about this nuclear ownership of nuclear weapon issue that I raised?
Oh, in Ukraine. Yeah, but you know what? Washington, London, and Moscow are going on the premise here that ownership is 9/10 of hands-on. And right now it's in Ukraine. And we don't want them here. They have to come out. But if they're coming out, that's fine, Raj. But when you agree to respect Ukrainian territorial integrity, respect the political structures of this country, respect Ukrainian sovereignty, that's part of the deal. And so go back to what I mentioned earlier. What do you think they're thinking in Israel, Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan? You can't trust the big powers. Can't trust them. Why would you trust them? They're after the resources. Why would you trust them? I wouldn't.
I'll come back on that, but others' hands are there. So Richard, you can ask. I'll come back on this later.
Mm-hmm. Who's next?
I think
Yusuf, I think. I think it's Yusuf.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, Yusuf.
Hi, sorry, I came, I wasn't here for the chat. I've actually questions, but I'll start with one. Now you mentioned the nuclear weapons, favoring the helicopter and also a big aircraft carriers. But I think it also brought the submarine on the stage, and I'd like let's start with this technical question. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, as the bomber, they were using B-29s in World War II, and they were using them in Korea and just after Korea. But that's going to change, because even in Yusuf, in 1945, the B-52 and B-47 bombers were on the drawing boards here in 45, because they know they're going to jet. They know they're going to jet power, and so these are going to be huge planes. able to carry nuclear ordnance because they know where the bombs are going. They're going to become bigger and more powerful. They know this. However, having said that, the Navy wants the carriers because that's mobility. But later on, when you have the intercontinental ballistic missiles, they are sedentary. They're sitting targets if you don't shoot them off. So what is a platform for mobility for strategic missiles? The submarine. And that's where you're going to go here. That's the triad. Like, if you remember that term, the triad of nuclear weapons: air, sea, and with the sea, it's the nuclear, it's the submarines. In fact, you can make the argument, and I've made this argument before, that it's not really the aircraft carrier that's the queen of the sea anymore. It's the submarine. We're not talking World War II submarines that used a diesel engine on the surface and a battery underwater. We are talking about nuclear submarines, which can go just as fast or faster underwater on nuclear power than a diesel submarine could go in World War II. And then they can carry nuclear missiles. That makes them a mobile platform, just like aircraft are. And so it's interesting. And you can position these, anywhere you want, these submarines. And they can launch wherever they're positioned. So it's fascinating to see this, how they figured this out, and how they've again, going back to the discussion I had with Sharon, how the technology changes. And it's improved with every new generation of a weapon. So interesting.
So Richard is having some difficulty, appears to me. So until Richard picks it up, I will. Yeah. Okay, you're there. Okay, good.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jean, followed by Janet.
Hello, Jane.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark, for a very interesting and necessary discussion. This is important, and we have to face reality. I wish you could say it's been a pleasure, but it's not a pleasure to look reality in the face sometimes, but it's necessary. I also want to point out that I come from this from a somewhat different perspective. You may notice I'm wearing my Veterans for Peace cap. And Veterans for Peace, as some of you know, is a educational and humanitarian organization dedicated to the abolishment of war. And that's what we do. That's what we're dedicated to. And that's the perspective that I bring to this. And many people regard Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the worst crimes in history. But my perspective is a little different on that, because that wasn't really the crime, because the crime came a few months later when, on the one hand, the United States decided to threaten its former ally, the Soviet Union, with nuclear weapons within months. I think it was in February. Over Iran, and then the Berlin Wall, a whole series of
Right,
threats.
1946 Iran.
Right, that the United States has consistently used the nuclear weapons to threaten nuclear and non-nuclear enemies. So I think that's really crucial. And China, of course, has pledged never to threaten or initiate a nuclear war. So the second part of that is, after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that was something that horrified humanity. And so that at the very first meeting of the United Nations, a resolution was put forth. It was put on the agenda to form the United Nations Commission. And the idea was to, all nations had to immediately give up nuclear weapons. And of course, the United States said no. And that kind of put us on the course that we're standing on now, we're pursuing, or the United States imperialism is pursuing. Right. I don't identify with the imperialists of our country. But I just wanted, it's not just man in the abstract that thinks these things up. It's specifically, it's the United States that has, invented the damn things, used them, and can threaten to use them the same way as I think Daniel Ellsberg says, when you walk into a 7-Eleven and show a weapon and demand their money, that's, you're using the firearm. And that's how nuclear weapons have been consistently used since World War II. So I just want to make those points and look forward to your observations on these.
Well, what you're talking about with your last comment is like, you're no different than Al Capone or Bugs Moran. Taking control of the local environment here in Chicago. It's no different here. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at America and the bomb at the end of the war, I mean, Gene, we come out of this war virtually untouched. We have more food than we can eat, more clothes than we can wear, more gas than we can burn, and more money than we can spend, and we got the bomb. That's primacy. And you can tell, Gene, you can tell where America is going at this point. Britain, the 1945 marked the end of European dominance. It's over. It's over. The two winners of this war are the United States and the Soviet Union. You remember I gave that talk on Herald of a New World Order. That's what you're seeing. Having said that, you can see where America's going, Gene, not just with the bombs, but with the dollar. The British came here, hat in hand. Keep in mind, this is a country, Gene, that was a $16 billion creditor nation in 1940. In 1945, they're a $12 billion debtor, and they've only got 12 million in gold left. They're going broke. They came here, Gene, asking for $3.7 billion. And you know what we're going to tell them? Sure, you can have that money, but $980 million has to be spent here in the United States or no deal. Number two, you have to pay all your imports have to be paid in either in the dollar or gold. Do you know we took in $27 billion of the world's gold in this war? We have 72% of the world's gold in our pockets. And we also told the British, if you think you're going to your Commonwealth nations for a better deal, forget it, our deal is off. Where are they going? The dollar is the world's reserve currency. Where are they going? Nowhere. And there's a Lord Boothby in Parliament. And you know what Lord Boothby said? This was an economic Munich. That's the terminology he used, an economic Munich. The man is right. So you know right off the bat where America's going in 1945.
Thank you.
It's obvious.
Yeah.
Obvious.
Well, thank you. And this is something we'll continue to be discussing, I'm sure.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I
Next,
really appreciate your perspectives on this. And the encyclopedic you carry around in your head.
Yeah, even though I'm an ex-Republican.
Keyword is X.
let's go to Janet Coburn, please.
Hello, Janet.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. There seems to be a belief in this discussion that nuclear war can be won. I mean, it's like, I don't think so.
Some
But
people believe that.
I know, but I don't believe, yeah, I don't. And not only are we're not talking about atomic bombs, we're talking about hydrogen bombs now.
Right.
My understanding of the Ukraine situation has primarily been informed by Scott Ritter. I'm a big follower of Scott Ritter. I posted a 13-minute interview in the chat. And the title is NATO is a suicide pill for the world. Pray that Russia wins. And the questions that were asked of him are similar to what is in this discussion today. So I really urge everybody to watch that. Scott talks about Russia's position now. It's been changed to not first strike, but like preemptive kind of nuclear strike, where if Russia detects that a nuclear bomb, let's say, has been launched, before it even lands, they're going to be countering it, Russia.
Right.
And even if nuclear bombs hit Russia, they have something called the dead hand, which if Russia is destroyed, this mechanism that's in place will be active anyway. It's dead. It's an automated, some kind of automated thing.
An automated system.
Yeah, that will result in the world will end. It'll be over for all of us. So I just wanted to share that. I tend to agree that that's what the scenario would be if the West, to me, the US is the only country that has dropped nuclear weapons. And so would we put it past the US to do it again? I don't know. But I mean, there are other countries that have it, but still the US would be behind this. And with the current buildup by the West now of weapons into Ukraine, it's like getting really, really dangerous for this kind of thing to happen. So, I really like your comments on that, but there's one other question that I had that it's about something you said early on in your presentation, and I might have misunderstood it, but I thought you said that in the mid to late 50s that NATO was working on nuclear strategies in the Pacific.
No, they were working on fighting a nuclear battlefield in Europe.
Oh, in Europe. Oh, okay.
Europe. And they were using, pardon me, they were using light planes and the rudimentary helicopters that existed to move people around.
Okay, I was just wondering if they had been trying to spread out to the Pacific then, but no. Okay,
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, going back to what you said earlier about nuclear weapons. Yes, today, if one power uses low-level nukes on a battlefield, will there be the escalatory process following? Probably yes. Where do you stop? I used it here to blow up this 10-mile chunk, but the people that lost the 10-mile chunk, are they just going to sit here and take this? Meaning the Russians. Let's say we use it first, and are they going to take the hit, or are they going to launch something that's going to knock out a 50-mile chunk? And
No, we're going to launch the whole shebang, I think.
Well, interesting. And I bring that up purposely because in 1940, into 45, going into 46, many nations in the world sent their scientists to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to do their own studies. The Soviets did this too. The scientists did their study, collated all their information, and handed it in to the government. Stalin saw this. In 1947, he observed that, of course, we're talking about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. Stalin thought that if they got into a war with the United States then, the Soviets could take 4 or 5, even 6 of those bombs and still keep fighting. Now, he's comparing the damage wrought at Hiroshima and Nagasaki with 4 years of damage incurred at the hands of the Germans on the Eastern Front. In that period from June 22nd, 41 to May 7, 45, some 70,000 hamlets, villages, and towns had been wiped off the map in the Soviet Union. Now Now that's conventional war. I'll give you that. But at the time, he's making this comparison. Now, if you sit down and think, Stalin's right. He's right. They could take those hits and still keep fighting. Today, can you take a hit? Can you take the hits from the weapons they have today and still keep fighting? What are you, in a dream world? That's not gonna happen. It's not gonna happen. And so this is what I said earlier about man's technology. Each generation, it's gotten worse. So where does it stop? Where does it stop? So that's the point. That's the point.
Okay. Next is Sharon, followed by Yusuf.
Thank you. So I think that it's worth, from a historical point of view, to look at the decision made by the, speaking of Stalin, the decision made by the Soviet Union to develop their own nuclear weapons and engage in the mutual assured destruction that ensued, which is still with us today. And
Right.
I just wonder what people think about that. I think that that decision had something to do with the ultimate demise of the Soviet Union because of the resources that it took, to the enormous resources, first of all, that it took just to rebuild from the destruction that Mark just referenced, the horrendous destruction of the Soviet Union from the war, and then to decide to put so much national resources into the development of and the continued technological development that Mark also referenced. I think they had a choice, and some people say they had no choice. And I have not studied this, but very deeply. But what if they had made a different choice? The Chinese policy, although they do have nuclear weapons, but I don't think their policy is the same as what the Soviets pursued, tit for tat, the mad policy. And I wonder what other people think about that.
Well, they're not in that original standoff either. They're not coming till years later with nuclear weapons.
Oh, the Chinese, yeah, I understand.
Right. And so this process is evolving too. India will join the nuclear club. Britain and France were already in it. The Germans could have joined and decided not. Now that, of course, brings up historical phobias too here, if the Germans jumped into this. But having said that, countries like India, China, and now Pakistan has the bomb. North Korea has the bomb. Israel has had the bomb for years. Yeah. And that was a concern of John. In fact, I have in my archives a letter that Kennedy was discussing with I think it was McGeorge Bundy about the spread of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. And one of his primary concerns was with who? Israel getting the bomb. Now, there are many people in this country who like to vilify Iran. But let's understand something. Guess who gave Iran their first reactor? We did in 1959. We gave them their first uranium. We gave them their first plutonium because the Shah opened up nuclear research at Tehran University in 1957. And then, but let's give the Israelis their due. The Iranians their due. They joined the NPT treaty and opened themselves up for inspections. They did that. Yet, and I find this fascinating. This is all part of this history. When the British announced they're pulling their troops out of the Gulf states in 1969, and they do it in 1971, that's when the Shah is going to become the benefactor to represent the West in the Middle East, because nobody else here can do it. And by doing that, he says he's going to put a full court press on atomic research. Why? Because he says he's planning for the day when they run out of oil and gas. And so the United States, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, South Africa, Denmark even got into this. They began pouring money into Iran. However, with the Shia revolution in 78, 79, what did the Ayatollah announce? Atomic weapons are an affront to God, and nuclear energy is an insult to Islam. And he cut the program. He stopped the program. So it's interesting. It's interesting what some people, whether we vilify them or not, and their stand on nuclear weapons. It's fascinating. Kind of opens up a better understanding of where you are with this situation. I'm not saying it brings us to a finality here. It doesn't, but you can understand it better when you know what the participants, how they're thinking and how they're acting. So that's what I find anyway.
Thank you. I'm going to change the order a little bit and go to some people who haven't questions yet. Next speaker is Mehmet, followed by Rich J.
I
Mehmet.
thank you. Yeah, thank you for the great presentation. But let me follow up with what Sharon was asking. Is that, was there a third way? I really don't think so. Let's remember that once the Soviets created the bombs, then the United States stopped using them. I mean, and I believe that for how long it has existed, the Soviet Union's lifespan, I think, is due to them having the bomb. Yes, it did cost them a lot. Yes, that is not in a socialist development plan to waste away your resources on destructive bombs and everything. Yes, of course. But we live in a world where you are under attack by somebody who has sworn that they will kill you. And look at Iraq, Libya, Syria can attest to what happens when you don't have the bomb. What do you say, Mark?
Well, to add to what you just said, and I think you're correct, go back to 1948-49 when the idea of NATO was broached. And it's George Kennan who said no to NATO. He says, because you're going to get the appropriate response from Moscow. And it was called the Warsaw Pact. He said NATO was a mistake. He's the same guy who's going to tell Clinton in 93 and 94, don't spread NATO into Eastern and Central Europe. You're asking for a world of trouble. That's George Kennan who's telling you that. That's the same man, Mehmet, who told Truman in 1950, don't listen to MacArthur. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Don't listen to the Joint Chiefs. They don't know what they're talking about. And don't listen to Paul Nietzsche. Once you evict the North Korean troops from South Korea, you stop at the 38th parallel. That's called containment. He says, if you go north, you're going to bring the Chinese into the war. What happened? Man was right. He was right. He was right on all counts. He was right on all counts. So it's interesting what you're saying about the Soviets building nuclear weapons. Of course, they're going to build them. And this goes back, Mehmet, to what the French said after the Soviet Union collapsed. They warned that with the United States as the sole superpower, there is no check on American power. Now, that's balance of power politics, Mehmet. And if anyone knows how to play balance of power politics, it's the French. They did it for centuries with the British, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Portuguese, so on and so forth. They're right, you know. They were right. The French were right. But now it's not a unipolar world anymore. It is now multipolar. And so the United States, you know, some people might boast of our nuclear power, but now Russia and China are together in this thing with Ukraine, but China supports Putin. But at the same time, would India now, you know, India now is getting 1.2 million barrels a day from Russia, oil. And the US doesn't like this. Now, where does that, and India's a nuclear power, where does that put them? What side of the aisle? So, I mean, and these are questions, if you're sitting in Washington, you got to ask these questions. Because if you don't ask these questions, what kind of a policymaker are you? Interesting. Interesting.
Okay, next
Fascinating.
is Rich. Jay, go ahead, please. Rich J.
Hello, I'm here. I'm going to ask or speak to the question briefly, but I'm asking you. Thank you for the great We've had so many great programs lately. I don't know what to say every time I say the same thing, but I love this program. There's so much I didn't know, so much research and whatever Eugene said, encyclopedic memory, all that. I really, really appreciate it. I was born in '44, and I think about it a lot. My whole life has been a world of war. And where's this come from? Yeah, right here. So anyway, my question or my interest is what I would consider at the moment. I just thought of the expression, the elephant in the room, and that is, what do we call this? You haven't spoken directly. I think it's been inferred a number of times, the question of nuclear winter. In other words, how many nuclear bombs do you have to drop in how many places before it's the end of the world, not because directly because of where the bomb lands or whatever, but what it does to the atmosphere, to the environment, and the rest of the living organisms, not just human beings destroying things, but everyone else, every other entity, whatever, that will be destroyed in the process. Could you speak to that a bit? I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, whenever someone asks me this question, I always tell them, take a look at what happened for the following year after Krakatoa blew its stack in the 19th century. They had, and this is documented, they had some spectacular sunshines in England a year afterward because of all the debris thrown up. When Krakatoa blew its top in the Sunda Strait, where the Dutch East Indies, it was heard in Tokyo 1,000 miles away. It's the greatest, and it sent a shockwave. Get this, it sent a shockwave 6 times around the globe. We will have snow here in New England every single month of the year, even if it's just flurries. And not only that, they had snow in the Sahara, even in the summer, even if it's just flurries. That was the effect of Krakatoa. So if you want to get at least an idea of what can happen in a nuclear winter, go back and read some of what happened following the Krakatoa when it blew its stack in the 1880s. It's frightening. In fact, that island has been built up again. And they think somewhere along the line, it's going to blow again because it's on that ring of fire that they call it, with all those volcanoes that are, that ring in the Pacific and then going into South America. So if you have an understanding of Krakatoa, that would give you an inkling of what you can expect if man launches this violent volcano of nuclear weapons, that he's made himself. Mother Nature is fascinating from this perspective. Again, what happened with Krakatoa? I mean, that makes Mount St. Helens look like a firecracker. It does. It did. It did. Interesting.
Thank you.
Scare the
Thank
hell
you.
out
Good job.
of
I'll
you.
learn about Krakatoa.
And you'll be
Thank you.
shocked at what you find here. You'll be shocked.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, the next questioners are Yusuf, Jean, and Raj. Go ahead, Yusuf.
Thank you. I would like to go back to the nuclear effort. Now, Germany did have Heisenberg. He was one of the founders of quantum mechanics.
Right.
I'm not saying he was a Nazi, but he was known as politically conservative. He accused Iraq of being a Marxist, which he wasn't. But now Heisenberg officially says that he deliberately slowed down the German nuclear effort. But however, there are some indications about that. After the war, where he was interned in a villa in England with other Germans, and the British intelligence had the whole villa, the whole house bugged, and they were listening to the conversation. When he heard the news about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, at first he disbelieved it, and then he thought a little bit and he said, yes, I think I made a mistake. Also, German, he went into the direction of heavy water as a
Right.
moderator, which didn't prove to be a good idea. Whereas the graphite moderator used by states panned out.
Right.
Heisenberg may very well have not made a deliberately sabotage the German nuclear effort. He just simply fortunately made a mistake. And of course, Germany wasn't deficient of resources. So do you have any opinion on this?
Yeah, I do. It's the British SOE and the Norwegian underground in 1943 that really put paid to the heavy water, because the Germans were making heavy water at Norsk Hydro in Norway. And so in 1943, they had casks of this stuff, put them on trucks and put them on a ferry to cross this lake, and then sent it to the docks. And the British SO and the British SOE, the Special Operations Executive, their terrorist unit, and the Norwegian underground put limpet mines on the bottom of this ferry and sank it. And there all that when that heavy water, because it takes a long time to get the heavy water. And so the German progression on trying to get to a bomb was interrupted here. But of course, many of the Nazis, Yusuf, are thinking that this is just Jewish physics. This atomic science is Jewish physics because many of the scientists were Jewish. But having said that, getting back into this episode of a German bomb, and then also the nerve gas. That's a weapon of mass destruction, is nerve gas. The Germans, get this, and I have this, and I have a number of books on air power. And one of them is a book written by William Green quite a while ago. And it's all about plane types. The Germans had a plane called the Junkers 290. It was a 4-engine transport. They cannibalized one of these and they made 3 of them called the Junkers 390. It had 6 engines. It was almost as big as a B-52. And this plane, one of them took off from Mont-de-Marsan, France, which is in that southwest corner just above the Spanish border. This thing flew across the Bay of Biscay, clear across the Atlantic, to 12 miles outside New York City, turned around and flew back and made it over 6,000 miles. Now, picture this, if you will, if they had had a nerve gas bomb, or let's say even an atomic bomb, and dropped it on Times Square or Wall Street. The plane was available. The plane was available to do this. And it was bigger than a B-29. But the Germans only made 3 of them. And after the Junkers 390 flew in January, they did next to nothing with it afterwards. Part of that's because they needed fighter planes because of the American and British bombing attacks against Germany. So it's interesting, you know, talking about what you were just bringing up, but then again, add this plane into this. You know, you begin to get parts in this puzzle. It's fascinating, fascinating. Over 6,000 miles this thing went. And then it really never flew again. Never flew again. Well, what might have been? It doesn't happen, but what might have been does give you pause to think. Does give you pause to think. And yet the United States is going to do it with the B-29 flying off Tinian on April 6, 1945.
Okay.
Fascinating.
Next is Gene.
Oh,
Okay.
Gene.
Well, thank you. And again, I appreciate this discussion and everybody's comments. I just had a couple comments. One is this policy of MAD, or mutual assured destruction. I think the US policy has been somewhat different. I call it nuclear use tactically and strategically, or NUTS. And that's been the operational policy that our country has had. And secondly, on China, I think Mao in 1954 or so said something to the effect that we have to have this thing if we don't want to be bullied. And so they did develop nuclear weapons, but they've had a policy that they will never, under any conditions, use nuclear weapons first or use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear enemy. And so they don't have the policy of launch on warning. Instead, they have the capability to, if there is an attack on them and that's verified, only then will
Right.
they launch their nuclear weapons, because they still have enough hidden around somewhere that they could launch a destructive thing. And the third, a little minor note, I noticed that when there was a conflict between India and China, both nuclear powers
Right.
over this little border region there, the soldiers fought with sticks and rocks and clubs, not other military. And I find that interesting. I just wanted to see your comments on this.
You know, when you just said, Gene, sticks and rocks, and there was an American general who said this, and for the life of me, I can't recall his name, that said that the potential of nuclear war, who's ever left will only have sticks and rocks to fight with.
Yeah, could have been Oppenheimer or Eisenhower. I've heard that. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Or Einstein, perhaps.
Yeah, which I think it was. No, now that you mention it, I think it was Einstein. But there was an American general who said the same sort of thing. But I think it was Einstein. But there's truth to this, right? You're going back to the dark ages, to the time when man was just beginning to put together societies. We're going back BC, by the way. We're going back BC. But is that what getting back to Richard's comment about a nuclear winter, is that where it could carry him? Those who survive. That's if those who survive, you know. But then again, we don't know what kind of world we're going to have. We can theorize. We might have a pretty good perspective, but we don't know exactly what kind of world we're going to have. We really don't. And then what about the food supply? Talking about someone in the chat brought up radiation. What about food supply?
Absolutely.
Right,
A
exactly.
little question I just want to throw at you is, there's this book, Giving Up the Gun. It's about Japan when, towards the end of the Tokugawa period, the samurai they had brought guns into, the Portuguese brought guns, and they fought some wars with guns, but then they just decided no, partly because that impinged upon samurai privileges of carrying swords, but also it was just a barbaric instrument. I mean, if you be civilized, just kill people with a sword. That's the way to go.
Yeah, and
What are your
but then again,
comments on that?
but then again, Gene, in the 19th century, when Japan decided to modernize and industrialize, they're going to put together a conscript army, and they're going to take out the samurai. They're going to take them out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then again, just to add a little footnote here, that's what the Japanese army is going to go with, the Bushido belief in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Interesting.
Yeah. Another little interesting, the Meiji Restoration was led by the samurai, partly from Choshu daimyo, and they had a custom. Every New Year's, all the daimyo would gather at the foot of all the samurai would gather at the foot of the daimyo's castle and say, is this the year we're going to overthrow the hated Tokugawa regime? And every year they'd come out and say, no, not this year. Until 1867, they said, let's go for it.
Right. Yeah.
So another little tidbit that Japan's a nice country, interesting country.
Yes, it is.
Anyway, thank you.
No, you're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, next is Raj.
Okay, thank you. So I want to actually discuss with you and get your comments on the question of ideology and how it affects this threat of nuclear weapons. And we have discussed it, how Soviet Union only acquired nuclear weapons and doctrines in order to save itself, because in the early 1950s, under Eisenhower, there was this plan to do simultaneous nuclear bombing of two new communist countries, Soviet Union, which was not so new, but China. And they had planned to drop between 400 to 500 nuclear bombs simultaneously, more or less simultaneously in both countries, and end communism once and for all. And Daniel Ellsberg, who used to live, and I think still lives about 2 miles from where I live, was a young researcher in the State Department, and he studied it, you know about that. And that nuclear winter came out of that, and that's when it was pulled. Eisenhower also said in 1945 bombings that we didn't have to hit them with that awful thing. In other words, Eisenhower, as commander-in-chief of Allied forces, didn't believe Japan needed to be defeated with those. So even though the soldiers, you said, okay, thank God for that. Right. And there was a relief in America, okay, that ended the war. And this myth was continued that it saved lives. So, but the ideology plays. What I'm saying is that you talk about human nature, and I want to kind of get your response to it. That's Nietzsche's idea, will to power. Okay, in other words, everybody has a will to power. And versus Marx's idea that human beings are capable of acting in a civilized way, in harmony with nature and with each other, which is socialism and communism. So which is what I have seen displayed by Soviet Union, by Chinese doctrine, Indian, because India has the ideology of peace for a long time, even though Modi is kind of tampering with it, and Iran. All these civilizations, old civilizations, and Russia as a socialist, both China, Russia has Soviet, I mean, they have revolutions. So these two elements are either one will dominate and that the human race will have a future, or the will to power of Nietzsche, which with the nuclear weapons in their hand, some crazy person will end the world. So I just wanted to have your comments on these things. I'm hoping that it is Marx who's right, that we can transform the world, which is our motto, and that we, in the end, just like the First and Second World War created first and two giant communist countries, the next war, which we are going through right now through Ukraine, would not evolve into nuclear war, but instead transform the world into what you also believe, along with Alexander Dugin and many others, a multipolar war. So I want your comments on that. Thank you.
The idea, going back to what you said, Nietzsche, the will to power.
Yeah.
I was I'm reading 3 books, and one of them is Germany prior to the First World War, written by a man by the name of General Friedrich von Bernhardi. And he gets into the biological necessity of war. And the biological necessity of war is getting rid of nuisance strains that are perceived as a threat to your nation. For instance, coming out of the 19th century, Raj, in Europe, the Pan-Slav flood. That was that Austrian idea, which the Germans are gonna go with. And I might touch on that again in 2 weeks when I do Hitler, because he was Austrian. He wasn't born in Germany. And of course, that gets us to that birther argument, doesn't it? Gee whiz, Obama wasn't born here? Remember that one? Yeah, of course. But having said that, this idea of a biological necessity of war, I mean, go to the Pacific War. That was a race war. Americans against Japanese, that was a race war. To a certain extent, the war on the Eastern Front, Germans against Russians, that was in part a race war. And that gets us in part to that beware the Pan-Slav flood. Now, the problem here is with war, you create this plastic patriotism. I call it plastic patriotism. You constantly, the powers that be will constantly preach on reducing the enemy in the most abusive terms to get the population galvanized to fight the war. I mean, come back here. The word Jap, I mean, that kind of cheapens being Japanese in the eyes of the people who use it. How about, to me, Jew is kind of gutter. I always say Jewish people. A Jew to me sounds cheap. Or come back here though. Squareheads, Krauts, Huns, anything to reduce the enemy makes it easier to fight him, and it lessens that enemy as part of the human family. That's part of war. And this book bears this out. Now, I'm also reading another book by a Wilfred Trotter. It's called The Basic Instinct, the Basic Instinct of Man in Peacetime and War. The book was written in 1914, 1919. This man had a big influence on Edward Bernays, if you're familiar with him. Bernays is the one who literally invented American consumerism. And Trotter had a big influence on him because the instinct of the human condition is one where, man is a social animal. People who consider themselves islands are seen as outside the human family. So it's like Georg Hegel. The optimum endeavor of any people is the state. The people are second to the state. That's the essence of fascism. That's the essence of Mussolini's corporate fascist state. The right of the individual is second to the right of the state. Hitler comes along and says, no, the optimum endeavor is not the state. It is the preservation of the species. And so when you do that, you are creating these islands, these factionalized entities of people who downgrade other people, and then when they go to war with them, What happened to the Jewish people in World War II? What happened to the Slavs? What happened to the Gypsies? What happened between the Rwandas and the Tutsis? You know, so it's not just European, it can be anybody. And so this idea and man does this a lot. He does this a lot. We can't seem to get over this. And even Marx with his, you know, the constant struggle between the haves and the have-nots. I agree with Marx on that. And I don't think, to be perfectly honest, I don't think it's going to stop. It's not stopping here. I mean, look how much the few made over the many during COVID. That has to be thrown in here. Again, the few, and I've given talks on this, making society work for the few. And so people even shut out their own to have primacy here. And you have to throw war into this, which is one of the reasons man can't seem to get off this merry-go-round. And now you have nuclear weapons in the mix, you know. And so if someone thinks, depending on the situation, they can get away with using a nuke to forward their doctrine, don't be surprised if someone does this. And I have less faith in leaders today, especially here, as opposed to some of the leaders during the Cold War, who at least had to make a deal with the Russians called mutual assured destruction. I don't like this idea. It's got the proper name, MAD. But if one launches, the other launches. Well, then what's the point? It's almost like that movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still. Remember that movie? Where this man comes down from outer space and he tells the Earthlings, you people can fight all your wars between yourselves all you want. But once you take your wars off this planet in outer space, we're destroying your planet. That message is lost.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well,
Well,
thank you for that question.
yeah, I don't see any more questions or comments from the audience, and this is usually the time when we end up our meeting. But we usually end up with the speaker making, if you want, Mark, if you want to have some final thoughts, and then we'll wind up the meeting.
Sure. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be giving that talk on the Chancellor. Because this month, January 30 to be exact, it's 90 years ago that Hitler was ascended to the Chancellorship of Germany. But then the gist of that talk is going to be, he did not take power, it was given to him. And I'm going to go into that litany of how he got to that point. And I'm going to go beyond January 30, 1933 for a little bit too, on how he finally was able to create this Third Reich or Nazi Germany. But it's a fascinating look into how a country is supposed to be cultured, intelligent, well-educated, and what possessed them to have, as President Paul von Hindenburg used to say, that vulgar little corporal from Austria.
Okay, we're looking forward to that. Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, everybody. We're going to stop the recording now and end the meeting. But the formal meeting, we'll still have it open if people want to engage in some informal discussion, but the meeting is over. Thanks again, Mark Albertson and everybody.
Thank
Goodbye.
you, Mark.
One
Thanks,
thing I
Mark.
did was I put my email addresses in the chat. So if you have a thought or a question after the fact, hey, send it along.
You Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.